Look around the room and think about how many men and women are in here. Consider that 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men, aged 18 and older, have been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner. Psalm 72:14 states, "He will rescue them from oppression and violence, for precious is their blood in his sight." God tells us, his people, whom he loves beyond our understanding, that he will rescue us from despair. And for those who suffer by the hands of another, this is the initial comfort I hope they accept. But what happens next? In the case of a civil domestic violence action, the victim is not asking the court to punish the abuser. Rather, they are asking for protection from the person who's been abusing them. The criminal law system involves the abuser being charged with a crime. The prosecutor, who is the one who has control over the case, determines if it continues or not. However, studies show that abusers take advantage of loopholes in the law that can prevent their victim from being protected, and up to 2/3 of the time feel emboldened to violate a protection order against them. This is not acceptable and not the way our legal system should function. In To Kill a Mockingbird, it states, "Our courts have their faults, as does any human institution, but in this country, our courts are the great liberals, and in our courts, all men are created equal. It is crucial for a victim in court to receive total protection under the law." For clarity, domestic violence can be defined as abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. Gabby Petito went missing on September 11, 2021. She was a 22-year-old blogger who was traveling in a van with her fiancé, Brian Laundrie. When Gabby went missing, a police body cam video was released of an interaction that Gabby and Brian had with officers from the Moab City Police Department in Utah just a few weeks earlier. In the video, Gabby is crying and visibly upset after an interaction with Brian. The officers were responding to a 911 call where the caller reported seeing Brian hit and slap Gabby. When the officers pulled over Brian and Gabby in their van, they separated them. Both Gabby and Brian said that she had hit him. When the officers asked Gabby if Brian was violent with her, she responded with, "I guess yeah, but I hit him first." Without asking Brian if he was physical with Gabby, the officers determined Gabby to be the primary aggressor, but let her off without a citation or an arrest. When Gabby's mother stopped hearing from her, Gabby's mother, father, stepmother, and stepfather reported her missing to the authorities. On September 11, 2021, Gabby Petito officially became a missing person. On September 19th, Gabby's remains were found in a national park near the Tetons. By the time Gabby's body was discovered, Brian's parents said that he was missing too. Weeks later, Brian's body was found uncovered in a Florida nature reserve. He had died from gunshot in the head and wrote in a notebook that he was responsible for Gabby's death. Gabby's parents filed a lawsuit against the Moab City Police Department and the officers involved in that stop that day for negligence. The report noted that the officers did not have the proper domestic violence training to investigate Gabby's situation, did not properly assess the circumstances, including to identify Brian as the primary aggressor. The report also noted that the officers made several unintentional mistakes that day, including misinterpreting the law and not making an arrest. The family believes that Gabby would still be alive today if the officers had followed the law in how they handled Gabby's situation and had the proper domestic violence training. Each state in the U.S. approaches domestic violence differently, and because of this, there is no legal definition of domestic violence. Researchers, such as authors, lawyers, and even domestic violence victims, have come to the conclusion that the legal system lacks adequate victim support. Lee Goodmark, who is the author of Decriminalizing Domestic Violence, a balanced policy approach to intimate partner violence, says that domestic violence data suggests that the legal system does not have an effective solution. A story from the Marshall Project Online states, Tara Conato, a 45-year-old mother of 4 children, abused by her husband, Ed Cunningham, was failed by the legal system. The accusations were true. He had hit her, slapped her, choked her, and even thrown her against the wall. The fight to leave her husband was not easy because he had convinced everyone she was insane, a common tactic used by abusers. Law enforcement interviewed 10 of Conato's friends, family members, and neighbors, all of which said that she was constantly in clear distress and often covered in bruises. Months after the trial, Cunningham took a charge in the form of a deferred prosecution agreement, a legal instrument that allows for defendants to avoid prosecution if they abide to a set of probation-like terms. For Cunningham, this meant his charge would be provisionally dismissed if he stayed away from Tara and underwent therapy. He was allowed to undergo therapy with Leah Nardis, a therapist who testified in court about her belief that Tara had alienated the children from their father. A year or so later, Tara lost custody of their children. Victims of domestic violence are often re-traumatized in court. If survivors choose to refuse to participate in these stressful encounters, they risk forfeiting their case, settlement money, and legal protection. Trauma by Trial, a public health post states, 83% of advocates say that the court process as a whole regularly re-traumatized their clients. 81% said that their clients were re-traumatized by seeing their abusers in court. And up to 60% said that the court personnel either said or behaved in a way that was disrespectful to their clients. Domestic violence. Most victims lack support from the legal system. How well is a victim protected after they seek help from the law? The U.S. Department of Justice shares that domestic violence-related police calls have been found to constitute the largest numbers of calls received by police. One of the most common ways a victim receives protection from the law is by obtaining a restraining order. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a restraining order as a court issued that prohibits an individual from carrying out a specific action, including contacting or approaching a specified person. Lenient sentences and low conviction rates are proof that domestic violence is not taken seriously. Does a piece of paper make a victim feel safer when their abusers are out free? According to the National Library of Medicine, the majority of intimate partner homicides involve physical abuse of the female by the male prior to the murder, no matter which partner is killed. Victims need more security. Domestic violence is a public health matter that requires response from social service agencies, healthcare providers, and law enforcement. Anyone can suffer from domestic violence, so the legal system should try harder to prevent it. According to the World Health Organization, it is proven that 1 in 3 women worldwide will experience sexual or physical intimate partner violence in their lifetime. Treating domestic violence more harshly will send the message that this behavior is not tolerated. Tara Canato's case is a perfect example of how the legal system is failing victims. Abused by Cunningham for years, she still lives with the fact that he can live his almost perfect life. Is it possible that he could find her and harm her again, abuse a new woman in his life? An article by Shelley Flannery states, 10 to 18% of those arrested for domestic violence are rearrested within 6 months. 15 to 30% face a second arrest within 28 months, and up to 60% will be rearrested within 10 years. Statistics from the American Bar Association state that 28 out of the 50 states do not require an immediate arrest on domestic violence reports and leave the decision up to the police. Immediate arrest can help. Not only is it unfair to leave a decision like this up to the officer's judgment, but how well do we know that we can trust their judgment? Imagine an officer is sent to a scene where someone is being abused, and the abuser convinces the officer into believing that the victim is just crazy, so then the officer does not make an arrest. For these reasons, I believe the law system faces many flaws when handling domestic violence. While some believe the legal system lacks adequate victim support, others argue that it is improving. Many who argue this would say that there are more resources available for victims. Resources include things such as hotlines, legal aid, counseling services, and shelter programs. If a victim needs to be protected from their abuser, then they can file for a civil case and receive a protection order. The legal system has significantly improved over the year, with better resources for victims, focusing on intervention for abusers and a great emphasis on victim safety, but the victims still face many challenges. An article by CBC News states, a 43-year-old woman was awarded $800,000 in civil court. The woman sustained a mild traumatic brain injury and faced many ongoing symptoms from the assault, including headaches, ear ringing, poor focus, and PTSD. The woman testified that chest pain from the attack prevented her from wearing a bra for nearly 6 months. The sum is due in part to the wages lost by the woman, a director at a high-profile video game company. Because the woman received the funds, it shows improvement in the law system. But is the woman protected from her abuser who received no charge? Exists a success story? Victims regain their control in civil court by getting in touch with better resources and by filing for a protective order, they gain protection from their abuser. Well, it is true that these resources put victims on the right path of getting control of their lives. It could be argued that the resources still fail them. The protection orders are not permitted. Others can argue that there is no lack of victim support because victims receive more than enough support from the resources like hotlines, legal aid, counseling services, and shelter programs. Violence against women by Greenhaven states, protective orders can usually be renewed only once, and then they expire. Protective orders should not expire. An abuser does not become less dangerous because a year or two has passed. Stalkers have been known to harass their victims for years. Does the threat of an abuser lessen over time? A statewide registry of protective and restraining orders is needed in every state. When a victim crosses a county line, the local police have no way of knowing if a restraining order presently exists. A person who violates a restraining order should be charged with a misdemeanor and as a punishment face a strong likelihood of jail time. There is inadequate training when handling cases of domestic violence. Violence against women by Greenhaven states, I often find that officers don't like enforcing protective orders for the same reason they don't like making arrests in most family abuse situations, because they know that even if they arrest the violator of the crime, the judge will not do anything substantial to him or her. There should be stricter legal measures to ensure protection. If an abuser violates a protective order and the judge does not sentence them, then the judge should be forced to justify why. While it is true that law enforcement receives training on domestic violence, is it strange that court personnel does not have the adequate training? The Saunders study from the U.S. Justice Department demonstrates that court professionals do not have the specific domestic violence knowledge they need, and this leads courts to disbelieve true cases of abuse. Others can argue that the court personnel do have enough training because they go through years of schooling for their position. All courtroom personnel should learn about the risk that victims in the courthouse face and the specific steps they can take to prevent courthouse violence. Training for both law enforcement and the judicial branch on evidence-based practices in handling domestic violence is important. It is also important that court personnel and law enforcement receives education on new and ongoing laws, as well as the resources available for victims. Many judges are now imposing sentences that reflect the severity of the crimes of domestic violence, non-stranger sexual assault, and stalking. Other judges, however, have yet to treat these crimes to their severity. Others can argue that it takes someone 9 years to become a judge, and attorneys go through about 7 years of training and schooling. Although, in Louisiana, for example, there is no requirement for judges and district attorneys to receive specific domestic violence training. The complexity of intimate partner violence is different from stranger violence. Even judges who work hard to understand domestic violence can become frustrated with the complexity of the problems, which can lead them to not give total protection to victims. Court administrators should establish practices and policies to ensure victim safety. The victim from the story received a grant for her struggles, but is she safe from her abuser who received no charge? It is troubling to see absolute discharge in a case of domestic violence as serious as this one. Why are situations like this still happening in the 21st century? Law enforcement and court personnel must work harder to protect their victims from their abusers. Law enforcement needs to take the reports of domestic violence more seriously. Judges can protect victim safety. They need to charge abusers to send the message that any abuse is not tolerated. Why is the legal system designed to protect but fail to do so? There is still hope to protect victims from their abusers. One of the biggest solutions would be better training for those in the legal system. Law enforcement authorities are notably poor at communicating penalties and policies to abusers. Abusers are ignorant of penalties, so if law enforcement is actively enforcing domestic violence laws, chances are domestic violence rates will plummet. There should be stricter legal measures to ensure protection for victims. Thank you. I would now like to open the floor for questions. Yes? Well, I don't think that abusers are getting charged for the severity of their crimes. So I think when someone abuses someone, then they should be charged, like they should be sentenced to jail, like for domestic violence. I don't think we should let them off with just a slap on the wrist. Ms. Hollis? Thank you.
I have two questions for you. Okay, so the first one is in your first example with Gabby and Brian, you talked about negligence. Do you think that Gabby was at all at fault?
Yes, I do believe that Gabby was at fault. I think they both were because they hit each other. But I think if the law enforcement and the officers that were involved in the stop that day had had the proper domestic violence training, then they could have asked better questions to really like get to the bottom of the case, and then ultimately that could have led to an arrest, and maybe they would both still be alive.
And my second question has to do with the resources that you mentioned for victim safety. You talked about hotlines and legal aids, counseling services, and shelter programs. But what do you think about more proactive resources that could support or give knowledge to either male or females who could potentially be victims?
I think possibly educating young teenagers, maybe in school, just on the signs of abusive relationships so they can prevent being in a domestic violence incident and prevent prevent that. And I think maybe if they want to take a further step, even self-defense classes so they can protect themselves. Mr. Davis.
So you picked a really complex topic especially in terms of solutions, because I think most police officers and judges would say this is the area they think the most about their jobs, because there doesn't seem to be any wins. There just seems to be a lot of losses. I'm curious if you have any solutions in mind for any of these things in terms of like how to see the problems fixed.
Well, I think for I think like I said, like just training, so just so like they can really learn about all the steps and all the complexity of the problems, because this is a tough situation because sometimes it's just like their words against each other. So I think if they really learn about like the psychology and like all like the mental effects, then maybe like it would be easier for them to solve these problems.
Yeah, and so, I mean, often like you said, he said, she said makes
Mm-hmm.
it complicated because frequently it's really hard to figure out what's truth. And a lot of times in domestic violence situations, people are trying to get each other in trouble, especially when there's like divorce or separation involved. I guess the other question I have is, what role do you think the church should play in any of this in terms of especially addressing the abuse itself?
That's a really good question. I think that for abusers, I think even the church could like provide counseling, so maybe like they can bring them to the Lord and like bring them to reflect on what they've done and lead them to Christ. I think for victims, they could also counsel them into just like healing from the situation and going to Christ. And even the church could educate the people of domestic violence, so like the church can help prevent it for them. Okay, if there are no further questions, thank you for your time.